Hello. In this video I'm going to be talking about a topic that I enjoy talking about very, very much, because this is the topic that allowed me to realize that I can actually have my mind changed about things. I used to be a fervent believer in libertarian free will, and then I listened to an argument that convinced me that there is no free will. And so in this video, I will be giving the argument against free will, and I'll also be responding to certain videos that I have found trying to defend free will. First, let's start off this discussion with definitions, because when talking about free will, people always disagree on the definitions. I'm going to try to be as clear as possible with the different views about free will. First, there is libertarian free will, which I'm going to define as the ability to have done otherwise. If you believe in libertarian free will, you believe that people, having gone back in time, could have chosen to do things different than the things that they actually did do. We could have done otherwise in a certain scenario. And then there is the determinist view, which, put simply, is the view that we could not have done otherwise, that all of our choices are in a sense determined because there's only one outcome that we could have done. And then there's the compatibilist view, which does not really have anything to do with being able to have done otherwise. It's essentially saying that it doesn't matter whether or not we could have done different things in scenarios, but we are still free because we are the agents or sources of our actions. So determinism doesn't matter, it's just we are free if we are the agents. And I'm personally not very interested in compatibilism because I don't really see agency or sourcehood as completely irrelevant to the discussion on free will. What I'm mostly concerned about is the ability to have done otherwise in certain circumstances. You can fight me on that if you want. I'm going to be responding to some compatibilist claims later in this video. Anyways, so now let's get into the main argument that I defend. This is a very simple, very popular argument that has two premises. The first premise, put simply, is that every choice that is made because of a want to make that choice. And then the second premise is that we do not control our wants. And so what follows from that, if every choice that we make is due to a want and we cannot control our wants, is that we do not control our choices, thus we do not have free will. Simple. So now I'm going to go into each of these premises in a bit more detail. First, that every choice is based on a want. More specifically, that every choice we make is made because of a want to make that choice. Now first I'm going to define a want. This is going to be very important, especially later on in the refutation section of this video. But a want is something like a desire or motivation, or a pull towards a certain idea or choice or option. And I'm going to point out, importantly, that a want does not have to involve any emotional attachment to a certain idea. Rather, it is simply just a motivation to go towards a certain option. So that is what a want is. It is a draw towards a certain option. That is our definition of want. So I'm going to demonstrate that every choice is based on a want through simple examples. Let's say I choose to pick up this thing right here, which is a microphone case. To me, it's quite clear that I picked this up because I had a want to pick it up to demonstrate a point. Let's say when I choose to go to the gym, I have a want to stay at home because I'm lazy, or I also have a want to get healthy and get fit and go to the gym. And because my desire to go to the gym, my want to go to the gym, is stronger than my want to stay at home, I'm going to want to go to the gym. And so every choice we make, I think, is due to a want. Every choice can be explained in terms of wants. You just have to analyze deep enough. And then the second premise is that we don't control our wants. And it's harder to demonstrate this premise, I think, than the first. But in order to try my best to demonstrate it, I'm simply going to ask you, the viewer, to try to choose to want something, because I simply don't think you can. Let's say that, again, I choose to pick this thing up. I can say I chose to pick it up because I wanted to pick it up to demonstrate a point. But did I choose to want to pick it up? I don't remember doing that, and I don't think I did. In my head, this is a very intuitive point, and in a sense, I think it's very similar to how we don't really choose the things that we believe in either. For example, when I was originally convinced that there is no free will, I listened to the argument, and I just happened to be convinced. I did not choose to be convinced. In fact, I didn't want to be convinced that there was no libertarian free will. I just was. And I feel like this whole want situation is very similar. We choose things based on our wants, but we don't control the things that we want. I want to get healthy and get fit. Did I choose to want that over wanting to stay at home and be lazy? I don't remember doing that. I don't think I chose that. So put simply, that's the argument against free will. And there are many responses to this argument. Let's get into the refutation section of this video. Now, there are two videos I'm going to try to respond to, and I'm going to talk a little bit about why I chose these two videos specifically. The first video is by a philosopher named Nathan Hawkins, and his video specifically is responding to the argument against free will brought up by Alex O'Connor, who, coincidentally, is the person who convinced me that there was no free will. And the reason I'm choosing to respond to this specific video is because when I was convinced that there was no free will, I didn't want it to be true. So I went around the internet scouring for podcasts or lectures going against the argument against free will. And this is the first one I found, and it's a very well thought out, well made video. So I'm going to play some clips of this video, and then I'm going to try my best to respond to these clips. Let's get started.
Suppose you are partway through a game of chess, and you're considering whether to move your knight or to move your bishop. And let's suppose you chose to move your knight. What explains that action? Presumably, if O'Connor is right, the reason you moved the knight is because you wanted to move it. But did you? It's not like you had some emotional attachment towards moving the knight that you didn't have towards moving the bishop. The reason you moved the knight was not an emotional one, but an intellectual one. A better explanation is to say that what you wanted was to win the game, and that you thought that moving the knight was better suited to winning the game than moving the bishop. In other words, your decision was based on a process of deliberation, a decision about what was more conducive to your wants. Your wants were involved in that process since they set the goal of the action. But the wants by themselves are not sufficient to explain what you did. An explanation in terms of wants can provide what philosophers call a simple explanation. Simple explanations place that event within a context that enables us to rationally make sense of that action. For example, if anyone were to ask, why did you move the knight? You can say, I moved the knight because I wanted to win the game. But an explanation solely in terms of wants fails to provide what philosophers call a contrastive explanation. A contrastive explanation explains why it was you did that thing rather than another thing. In this case, a contrastive explanation will have to say why you moved the knight instead of moving the bishop. And simply saying that you did it because you wanted to win the game isn't enough. What you need to do is add something to the explanation in terms of wants. Perhaps the belief that by moving the knight you are more likely to win the game than by moving the bishop. Now, since O'Connor is trying to say that actions based on wants mean that we couldn't have done otherwise and aren't free, he needs wants to provide a contrastive explanation for what we do and not simply a simple explanation.
So in this clip, Hawkins says that when moving a chess piece, when choosing to move a chess piece, we don't necessarily want to move the chess piece because we don't have a sort of emotional attachment to the option of moving that piece. And I think that's the first mistake that he makes here, is assuming that a want requires some sort of emotional attachment to an option. However, as I explained in my definition of a want, we do describe wants as desires or motivations, but I do think that the word desire has a sort of connotation that implies emotional attachment that I don't think is required in order for there to be a want. As long as there is some sort of motivation or draw towards the option of moving a chess piece with no emotional attachment at all, that is still a want. And later in the clip, Hawkins says that there needs to be a contrastive explanation for moving a knight rather than a bishop in a game of chess that an explanation in terms of wants does not provide. However, I actually think that explanations in terms of wants do provide contrastive explanations. I simply think in this example that Hawkins is not analyzing hard enough. Now, Hawkins did say that you may have a desire overall to win the game of chess. And now let's say you're in the scenario where you have the want to win the game of chess, and you also have the option of moving the knight or the bishop. Here is how I would analyze this. Well, if you want to win the game, let's say in this certain scenario, you want to be more on the offensive position, but also you want to maintain some level of defense because in order to win the game, you don't want certain pieces to be taken, but also you want to move a piece into an advantageous position, so that might mean you have a want to keep this piece where it is, to move this piece into a position where it can capture other pieces, and in this scenario, it could be the case that the knight is the only piece that accomplishes this in your eyes, and moving the bishop would actually put some of your pieces in danger. So the wants to win the game could lead to a series of wants that leads to you wanting to move the knight rather than moving the bishop. I think this is very clearly just a scenario where an explanation in terms of wants does provide contrastive explanation. I simply think that Hawkins here did not analyze deeply enough into this chess scenario. Let's get into the next clip.
Suppose a friend of yours decides to enlist in the army to fight in what they think of is a just war. They say they don't want to fight, but they've decided to enlist anyway because it is their duty. According to O'Connor, that must be because there is a stronger desire in the background. Perhaps their desire to do their duty is just stronger than their dislike of fighting. But I think such a conclusion is just mere prejudice. It would be perfectly reasonable for your friend to say that no, they don't want to do their duty at all. The only reason they're doing it is because it is their duty. In other words, the explanation they give for their action is one that appeals to duties and not to wants. This example brings up the idea that there can be a variety of reasons for our actions. Some of those reasons will be reasons for doing whatever it is we end up doing. Some will be reasons for not doing it, and some will be reasons for doing something else entirely. And these reasons can be all sorts. There can be desires and wants, but there can also be moral convictions, religious convictions, true beliefs, false beliefs, relationships with people involved, and a whole host of other factors. And it seems almost certain that some of the things we do not because we want to, but we do it for other reasons.
Now, in this example that Hawkins brings up, a friend of yours decides to go enlist in the army because it is his duty. And here, Hawkins thinks that it's completely fair if your friend says that they didn't want to go to the army, they actually just had a need to fulfill their duty, even if they didn't want to fulfill their duty. Here, I think, again, he makes the same mistake of assuming that a want requires some sort of emotional attachment to an idea. Here he seems to conflate a want to a liking for a certain choice. He says that because your friend doesn't like the idea of fighting, he doesn't have a want to go to the army. Rather, it is his duty and he feels a need to fulfill his duty. However, according to the definition of wants that I talked about, having a need or even a feeling of obligation to fulfill a duty is still a want because it is a motivation or draw towards that idea. A want does not require emotional connection at all. It's not whether you like something or not, even though we do describe it as a desire. What we mean by want when we say the term in this argument is simply a motivation or draw towards that option. So in this scenario, I would say that your friend has the want to fulfill their duty. Even if they don't like the idea, they don't think of going to the army in a positive way, they have that draw towards the idea of fulfilling their duty, even if it is a feeling of obligation or necessity rather than enjoying the idea of it. It is still a want. Let's go on to the next clip.
Suppose I decide to go to Spain. In reply to the question, why did you decide to go to Spain? I can respond by saying, because of Spain's beaches and architecture. But the reasons alone can't provide a contrastive explanation for my decision. For that, I must emphasize the decision's choice aspect. For example, in reply to the question, why did you go to Spain rather than Italy? I can respond by saying, because I chose Spain's beaches and architecture over Italy's wine and historic sites. So then, the choice and reasons can together provide both a simple and contrastive explanation of my decision. And in both cases, the explanation resides entirely within the decision itself, as two aspects of it. The decision is, therefore, rational and self-explaining. Note that the choice of the reasons is not some act that precedes the decision. Rather, it is the non-rational aspect of the decision act itself, the aspect that constitutes pure will. The rationality of the decision is provided by the reasons for that decision, i.e. the reasons chosen, which are not the same as reasons for that choice. There are no reasons for the choice, as it is not an act. The account I have just provided accommodates both features of free will I set out to explain. Number 1, as long as you had reasons to do otherwise, you could have decided to do otherwise by choosing those reasons. And number 2, your decision can be simply and contrastively explained by the reasons chosen. Finally, by providing an account of free will that locates the ultimate source of action in your decision to act, the sourced conception of free will is accommodated too.
So in this clip, Hawkins describes his own free will theory, where there are components such as the reasons for a choice, and then the choice between those reasons itself, which he says is not an act. Now, my response to this is that I think all of it can still be explained in terms of once, and probably should be explained in terms of once. Because I think where we would agree is that when there are choices to be made, when we're making a choice, there are always these reasons for making the choice. However, I believe that these reasons in and of themselves do not give any motivations towards making the decision. For example, in the decision to go to Spain rather than Italy because I forgot the exact reasons, architecture versus beaches or something like that. There are these reasons, right? I don't think just having those ideas in your head, like I would go to Spain for this reason and I would go to Italy for this reason. You can have those reasons. Just thinking of those in and of themselves are not going to get you to making a decision. Here is where I think Hawkins kind of presupposes or inserts an extra sort of thing that is free will, where he says, and then we just sort of choose out of these options, and that choice is not an act. To me, I think this is kind of unnecessary. I think the exact term might be ad hoc. I'm not sure if I'm using that correctly, but I think if you can explain it in terms of once, then you should explain it in terms of once, because that's kind of the most basic aspect of our experience that I can think of when it comes to making decisions. For example, you want to go to Spain for this reason, you want to go to Italy for this reason. I think we're naturally drawn to these two reasons, but we're going to be drawn to one more than the other. We have a want to go to Spain for this reason, we have a want to go to Italy for this reason. And whichever option we end up choosing is because the want to go to that place overpowered the want to go to the other place, thus providing a contrastive explanation. I still think that Hawkins' free will theory can still be explained in terms of once. He just has to analyze harder than he analyzes. Here he would probably say, I'm guessing, that you have the overarching want to go on vacation, but the options here are choosing to go to Spain or to go to Italy, and there are the different reasons for doing so, and then you choose based on these reasons. However, I think that even these reasons and these options can still be explained contrastively in terms of once. And I think that inserting something extra, such as this arbitrary choice that isn't exactly an act, is somewhat ad hoc and unnecessary because it can still be explained in terms of once. Now let's get on to the next clips, which are going to be talking more about natural laws and determinism, switching from sort of individual choice going more into overall metaphysical ideas.
Well, there are three general conceptions about what a natural law might be: supervenience conceptions, governing conceptions, and anti-realist conceptions. The supervenience conception of laws traces its roots back to David Hume, and so is sometimes called the Humean conception of laws. According to this view, first there is the world and all the events that occur within it, and then there are laws that describe patterns in those events that actually occur. According to this view, laws don't necessitate or compel anything. They simply emerge from the course of events that actually happens. So the Humean understanding takes an events first, laws second kind of approach. First there are particular and local facts, and the generalization to laws occurs as a result of them. A second conception of natural laws is a governing conception. According to this view, laws are real entities of some sort, such that they enforce their restrictions upon what is physically possible in the world. Whereas a supervenience conception takes an events first, laws second kind of approach, the governing conception says that first come the laws, and that these laws dictate to the world how it can actually occur. So a governing conception takes a laws first, events second kind of view. A third conception of natural laws is an anti-realist conception. According to this view, laws don't exist out there at all, either as patterns in events that occur, nor as governing entities that enforce themselves upon the world. Rather, they see laws as being generalized claims that help us make beliefs about what we think will occur or as explanations for what happens. In other words, they see laws as practical and useful tools for our thinking and explanation. So then, there are three ways in which we might conceive natural laws. And if there is a clash to be had between natural laws and free will, it could only be under the governing conception of laws, because it's only this conception that grants laws the ability to restrict what's possible.
So in this clip, Hawkins is describing the different theories of natural laws in the world, whether these scientific, mathematical, natural laws are governing, whether they enforce themselves upon the world, or whether these laws come out of the events that happen, or whether these laws simply describe what happens in the world. Now, the problem that I have is when Hawkins says that free will is only a problem under the governing conception of laws. Now, I actually just disagree, because I think that the world just operates in a deterministic way, even if the laws simply describe what happens in the world, which is the view that I take. I do get the vibe that the world happens, and then the laws that we have describe what happens. However, we cannot deny that the laws seem to work. They seem to accurately describe the relations within the world. And so, if the world operates in this relational sort of way, then I think determinism still works. The laws don't have to enforce themselves upon the world in order for the world to operate in a deterministic fashion. The idea I have about determinism has a few points. First, that physical laws describe relations within the world, and that every state of the universe within time is subject to these relations. So given any state of the universe that is subject to these relations, like if this happens, then this happens, 2 + 2 = 4, all of these things, then the past and the future seem to be fixed. And that is my idea of determinism, basically. It does not require any governing conception of laws. It only assumes the idea that the world operates in a deterministic fashion because the laws that we have that describe the world seem to work accurately. And so I do not think that a governing conception of laws is the only conception of laws that restricts possibilities and free will. It's simply a byproduct of how the world works. Let's move on to the next clip.
But let's suppose we do go with the governing conception of laws. How would that affect what we could or couldn't otherwise do? Well, it's not clear. If you have the governing conception of laws, then you need some explanation of how it is that they enforce themselves upon the world. You can't say that they merely describe what actually occurs, because that would be the supervenience conception. So you need some explanation of how it is that they manage to regulate what happens. One popular way to proceed is to see these governing laws as counterfactual truths. What they do is tell you what would have happened in non-actual circumstances. In other words, they tell you what would have been enforced had things been otherwise.
So in this clip, Hawkins is going with the idea that governing conception of laws is the only conception of laws that will prohibit free will, and he proceeds to say that governing laws assume this kind of counterfactual explanation type thing, where whenever we talk about a law, we're kind of assuming other possibilities, because a law is essentially saying, if this were to be the case, possibly, then this would happen. So this is his idea of governing laws. Even though I don't personally hold a governing conception of laws myself, we're going to go with this and move on to the next clip where he's going to talk more about this counterfactual idea and why it's actually important to the idea of free will.
No doubt, those that want to press the argument further will say that at the point at which you decide to act, P is a given fact, and the laws are a given fact. And so to analyse whether in this case you could have done otherwise, you have to keep both the past states of the universe fixed and the laws. And under such circumstances, you couldn't have done otherwise. But holding the past states of the universe fixed along with governing laws when asking what you could have done otherwise isn't what is done in any other counterfactual analysis. And with good reason. If you hold the past fixed and the laws, then nothing could have been otherwise. This isn't really a counterfactual analysis at all. Instead, it's the rejection of all counterfactual analysis, which, given what I've already said, is completely hypocritical of the free will denier. Remember, the free will denier needs the laws to be governing, and to ensure that they are governing, they justify this by using counterfactual reasoning. But then once they've used counterfactual reasoning to justify these laws being governing, they then deny such reasoning of the free will theorist. Yeah, that's fair. And you can't simply ditch the governing aspect of laws by denying all counterfactual analysis. Sure, you can hold Humean laws fixed, but to do that, you have to hold fixed every single actual fact. And that makes the argument a complete triviality. It amounts to saying that given everything is exactly as it is, you couldn't have done otherwise. Well, no shit, Sherlock.
Here, Hawkins is correct in saying that I, as somebody who defends determinism and a lack of free will say that when we make a decision, I do hold the past fixed as well as the natural laws. And Hawkins seems to agree with this, and that if this is the case, then we cannot have done otherwise. However, Hawkins' main response to this is to say that this is not what we do when we do counterfactual analysis. When we analyze scenarios like, if this was the case, then this would happen. However, my response is that I don't really see the power of counterfactual analysis in this way. Sure, we can talk about other possibilities, as in other possible worlds. However, I don't think that means we can access these possible worlds within the world that we are already in. Like, the world could have been otherwise, with a whole different past, with a whole different future, with a different scenario that is happening right now. But the fact of the matter is that where we are, when we are making a decision in the actual world, we have a given past. That is fixed. That cannot change. And so where we are right now in this world has that given fact, has that fixed past and the laws, which means that we cannot have done otherwise. If we go back in time to the same scenario that we were at, let's say 5 minutes ago, we cannot have done otherwise than the choice that we already did. Now he's saying that in counterfactual analysis we look at these other possibilities and that the entire world could have been otherwise. But the argument isn't that we cannot have been otherwise and that the entire world could not have been otherwise. That could have obviously been the case. However, the fact is that if we were to go back in time to a specific point when we're making a decision, given this exact same past that we have, that we could not have done otherwise in that scenario. It's not that we cannot have been otherwise, it's that we cannot have done otherwise in the exact same scenario with the exact same past. I don't see why Hawkins would say that counterfactual analysis means that we could have done otherwise in a certain scenario if in the actual world we have a specific past that has happened and we have these natural laws which accurately describe the world, which seems to act deterministically. Then yes, we cannot have done otherwise, and Hawkins seems to agree with me on this point. I simply disagree with his idea that the fact that we do counterfactual analysis means that we could have done otherwise in certain scenarios. I hope that made sense. There's one more clip from Hawkins I'd like to play, where he demonstrates his idea of we could have done otherwise a bit more clearly.
The reason arguments like Van Inwagen's have some intuitive pull is because they rule out a branching futures conception of the world. The branching futures conception assumes that everything that has happened has already happened and can't be changed, but that the future is somehow open. Now, if determinism is true according to natural governing laws, then this cannot be the view of the world. But a branching futures view of the world isn't required for free will. What you need for free will is sourcehood and could have done otherwise. Now, you don't need a branching future in order to have been able to do otherwise, because could have done otherwise is evaluated against different kinds of worlds, not different kinds of futures.
Here, Hawkins is basically proving my point in saying that if determinism is true, then the branching futures conception is wrong, where you cannot have a fixed past that branches out into different possible futures. I agree because I believe in determinism, basically. But he says that this is not what is required of free will. He says that in order to have free will, we simply need to be the sources of our actions, and there need to be different possible options to show that we could have done otherwise. So he brings up this graphic on screen, where there is a horizontal line that represents our actual world, our timeline, and then these different lines that run parallel to that to represent different possible worlds, and to say that these different possible worlds show that we could have done otherwise. However, I think that he is making a mistake in conflating could have done otherwise in a certain scenario with could have been otherwise as a whole different possible world. The only thing you demonstrate with these different parallel timelines that could have happened is that the entire world and the past and the future could have all been otherwise. Not that we could have gone back in time and chosen to do otherwise than what we did. Sure, we could be in some sort of different possible world. That would mean our entire past is different. That's not our world. We could not have done otherwise in our past. I do think you have to hold the past fixed. And so here I've completed my refutation of Nathan Hawkins' video. Now, I did not play all of Nathan Hawkins' video. It's very, very long, but I have watched all of it, and I encourage you to watch it all too. It's very well made. He is very eloquent, much more eloquent than me, and so I encourage you to go watch that because it's great. It's awesome in response to Alex O'Connor. Now, I do have a second video that I want to respond to, and this is a video by a YouTuber named MelonballerNick, and I'm going to call him Nick because I don't want to say that full username every single time. But the reason I'm choosing to respond to this specific video is because he's actually responding to the exact argument that I put forth in the very beginning of this video that has two premises and a conclusion. Every choice is made because of a want. We do not control our wants, therefore we do not control our choices. So first he actually talks about compatibilism, so I'm going to play that clip.
Free is in reference to whether or not the will is captive to the choices it makes. For example, compatibilism is often accused of being itself a manipulation of language, because it seems fairly counterintuitive to say that we are not captive to prior material conditions, but at the same time prior material conditions in some extent decide the choices we make. And while this following analogy doesn't truly encapsulate the different deeply philosophical arguments that compatibilists make, this is about as easy and approachable as I can make understanding compatibilism. Imagine a game that is based around dialogue options, and the premise of the game is supposed to be that whatever the player chooses to say affects the outcome of the game. But imagine that the game actually only gives the player the quote-unquote illusion of choice. All dialogue options actually result in the same outcomes by the end of the game. We can say in this analogy that this is a deterministic universe. What we'll still, however, have to concede is that even though the player has no quote-unquote true choices, the choices are still made by the player. If one player hands the controller to another, then this other person is playing the game, and the original person no longer has the sensory experience of playing the game. This is free will at its most minimum requirement, and this is how determinism and free will can be compatible.
So in this clip, Nick is describing compatibilism with a nice little analogy of somebody playing a video game that works in a deterministic fashion. And he says that if you are the one playing the game, you are the agent, that is the minimal requirement for there to be free will. Basically, you just need agency in order to have free will, even if you cannot have done otherwise, even if the world works in a deterministic way. And he did say that people often think compatibilism is just a manipulation of language. Honestly, that is basically what I agree with. I think that if you believe in compatibilism, I don't really have a problem with your metaphysical view of choices and things. It's just a labeling difference. You think that as long as we have agency, we can call that free will. And sure, you can call that free will. If that's the case, then we're just not talking about the same thing. This is why largely I do not really talk a lot about compatibilism, or at least I don't care a lot about compatibilism, because we don't have any metaphysical differences about how choices work or how the world works. You just decide to call agency free will. Meanwhile, what I'm concerned about is whether we could have done otherwise in a certain scenario, and I think not. However, Nick still responds to this idea that I hold, luckily by responding to the exact kind of argument I'm going to be talking about. Here I'm going to play the next clip I have.
This argument doesn't just manipulate language by attacking one position while claiming to attack all positions based on a faulty premise of what it means to have free will. It also exhibits two other language-based fallacies. One is obviously equivocation, as we'll get to. But the other one is a bit more complex and can really only be described as categorical fallacies that are given life by ambiguous uses of language. Let me explain. If we have A and B, someone argues that A causes B, and we came along and split A into A and alpha, claiming that alpha does not cause B, this would not be sufficient to prove that A does not cause B, even if our premises are true. To say otherwise and claim that A does not cause B is a categorical fallacy. Here is alpha. It belongs to A. It does not belong to things that cause B, but here outside of alpha belonging to A are things that cause B. You may ask yourself, how is this related to free will? Surely nobody would get this wrong. But the issue is that this is just one layer. As I said, what determinists commit in various arguments is a language fallacy, and this is a formal fallacy at the moment.
So before getting into his actual response to the argument against free will, Nick talks about certain fallacies that he believes determinists often make, determinists such as myself. He says that we often make categorical and language fallacies. So, in response to the next clips I'm going to play, I'm going to try to be as clear as possible with my definitions in order to not make any language fallacies.
When we go over these claims that we are tempted to accept as true, what are we really saying? When we use words like want or choose, what do we mean, and are we using these words consistently without equivocating? Well, want can mean to will, but it obviously also means to desire. And to choose can either mean to will or to act on our will. So when determinists say that we do what we want, and that we don't control what we want, such that what we do is not under our control, obviously under our control is about free will. But what is want supposed to mean in each statement? Is the second statement that we don't control what we will? If that's the case, then that's a circular argument. The conclusion is whether the will is free or not. We cannot conclude that it is not by assuming that it is not.
So Nick's main strategy in responding to this argument is to take two different definitions of the term want that he thinks determinists could mean and then explain how neither of them work. Now his first interpretation involves defining the word want as will, and saying that if this is the case, then the argument is circular, because we're saying we do what we will, we don't control what we will, therefore we don't have free will. However, here it seems like Nick is more confused about the definitions of the word want than we as determinists actually are, because he seems to conflate the term will in free will with will as in a sort of want or motivation. When we're talking about the word will in free will, we're not talking about a sort of motivation towards a certain option. I'm saying that I'm kind of a free agent, so we're saying that it kind of refers to like agency and we could have done otherwise. But when we say want as in will, when we say that we have the will to do something, it means something more like a motivation or desire, which is why I tried to be quite clear with my definitions of the word want. Now, as I said in the very beginning of this video, I think a want is something like a desire, motivation. Put simply, it's a pull towards a certain option. It does not require any sort of emotional motivation. It's not the same type of will that's used when we're talking about free will in general. So I think he conflates these two terms, and I'm going to move on to his second interpretation.
So then it must be instead that our desires are out of our control. But if this is the case, then in order to complete the argument without equivocating, the first premise must read that we do as we desire, which we often do not. If you do not enjoy work, or in that context desire it, then you do not choose to go to work because you want to. And if and when determinists respond back that you wanted to go to work, otherwise you wouldn't have gone if you were not willing to be there, here they are conflating want and will. I mean, it's right there. The context in which they now use want is will, as in willing. So it's not actually possible to make this argument without equivocating. These arguments require us to subtly change what we mean by want in order to cheat and arrive at the conclusion that we do not have free will.
So in this clip, Nick seems to make the same mistake that Hawkins made earlier in thinking that a want, if interpreted as a desire, means that you have to enjoy that choice or have some sort of emotional attachment to it. However, I think that this is incorrect. Because, as I noted earlier, very early on in the video, my definition of the word want is simply desire / motivation / pull towards something. It doesn't mean you have to like the idea. You have to actually emotionally enjoy the option, rather that you are just pulled towards the option. So even if you don't want to go to work, in the sense that you don't enjoy going to work, you still feel obligated to go to work because you want money or because you want to support your children. So you still have a want to go to work in the sense that you are motivated and that you feel an obligation to go to work. We have these motivations towards certain ideas, and we can't control these motivations or pulls. And that is where the entire idea of not having free will comes from. And here, I have finished responding to the 2 videos that I have meant to respond to. And I hope that this was helpful. The argument itself was very, very simple. Still 2 ideas. Every choice is made because of a want, motivation, pull towards that choice. And then we cannot control those motivations. We cannot control those wants. Again, every choice is made due to a want, and we do not control our wants. Therefore, we do not control our choices. It is very simple. I think that I've somewhat adequately responded to the videos. If you still want to fight me on these, you can. You can comment on the video. I'll try to respond. If you know who I am, you can contact me directly. And I hope you enjoyed. The end. Bye!